Hello and welcome. I started Camera Crusades just over 8 years ago with the intention of sharing my adventures, challenges, and photography along the way. Throughout that journey, I've learned a few things that I want to share with you and other inspiring photographers. This is the ultimate photography tool. It was created to provide easy-to-use, step-by-step instructions to create better photographs and images today. By using these simple steps of what pros look out for and how to prevent these common mistakes in amateur photographs, and why to use these steps to get better results. This is the ultimate photography tool. This is what you get when you download from the link below. Now, the first side of this has a couple of sections. The top section has just general knowledge that you need to know about of how to kind of use your equipment. Okay, things like your camera, basic functions, basic buttons, your camera manual, where to find different menu items so that you can make changes on your camera. F-stop, what that means and how to use it, your lenses, different choices, zooms, or different focal lengths, your shutter speed, tripod, and ISO. Now, the second section, the lower section here, is the actual steps of this tool, okay? And we have three columns. We have what, how, and why. And essentially how this works is, starting from the left and going to the right, we have kind of basic information, and then we kind of layer in more and more as we go along. So for this video, we're just going to be focusing on the what, the 6 steps of how to use this tool and how to take better photography. In later videos, we'll get into the how and the why, but that's a much lengthier video, and today we're keeping it simple. Let's take a look at the backside. So on the backside, we have a section called footnotes. Now these are additional details that would not fit on the front that have a much deeper dive of information so that I can explain what you're doing and why you're doing it. We also have the exposure triangle. This is how to get a perfect exposure. It contains aperture, shutter, and ISO. Those 3 components work together in harmony. And lastly, we have just a field of view chart so that when you're choosing your focal length, you can see how wide or how narrow that particular lens choice is. Let's take a look at the steps. Step 1, choose your focal length. Step 2, identify your focus point. Step 3, choose your f-stop. Step 4, select shutter speed. Step 5, select ISO. And finally, step 6, take the image. Now there's a lot more information contained within this tool. Get yours today with the digital download so you can follow along at home and on location when you're using it directly. Now let's take a closer look at these steps of the ultimate photography tool. Step 1, choose your focal length. Simply put, this is how much of the scene you will include within your composition. Wide or smaller focal lengths let you capture the whole scene, while narrow or long focal lengths let you simplify the composition by narrowing in on a part of the larger scene. So I'm down here at the local train station to get some great examples of our 6 steps. So I found a composition with the train station off to the right and the train tracks leading into the scene itself. And this is a 24 millimeter, a wider composition, whereas I also have selected a 50 millimeter composition so that when the train comes, I have both of those dialed in and I can see which one I prefer. Tips for how to use this step. Number 1, fill the frame and compose the elements for more dynamic images. Number 2, include key elements, including background elements, foreground elements, and midground elements. Step 3, check frame borders to remove distractions. Step 2, identify focus point. For step number 2, identifying your focus point, it is crucial for setting the stage for your main subject within the image. Your image should be in focus and positioned aesthetically to draw the viewer into the image. If your subject is out of focus, this will pull your viewer's eye elsewhere in the image. Now we want to identify where we focus. What is our main subject? Is it the immediate foreground, the midground, or the background? Tips for using this step. Number 1, Identify main subject within the image. What's most important? Number 2, consider depth of field for the image as we move into step number 3. Step number 3, choose f-stop or aperture. Following step 2 of identifying your focus point, we need to consider depth of field, or more simply put, the depth of sharp focus within your image. Choosing a larger f-stop, that's an f-stop closer to 1.8, provides a shallower depth of field. In most cases, this will blur the background, whereas a smaller f-stop, an f-stop that's closer to f22, will allow the entire image to have focus, although there are limitations on depth of field.
For our f-stop, we can choose something like f4 to really have a sharp focus on our foreground but blur the background, or f14 or f16 to give us that sharp foreground, midground, and background focus throughout the whole image.
Tips for using this step. Number 1, consider what elements within your image need to be in focus. Number 2, experiment with different f-stops, and you decide based on your own creativity, artistic choice, and style. Step number 4, select shutter speed. Selecting the right shutter speed is important for both freezing moving subjects, like a game-winning shot, or to blur moving items, like water at a waterfall, creating that silky smooth water. Practicing with different shutter speeds is a great way to be creative within your images.
For choosing our shutter speed, I have an image shot at 1/1200th of a second, which is a fast shutter speed, and this image shot at 1/50th of a second, a slower shutter speed. See how the first image is quite crisp and sharp and freezes the train? While as the second image, the train is blurry and the rest of the image is sharp.
Tips for this step. Number 1, if there is movement you want to freeze, use a higher shutter speed. Number 2, if there's movement you want to blur, use a slower shutter speed. Number 3, consider a tripod for slower shutter speeds when there's no movement within the scene. Step number 5, select ISO. Now that we have selected the f-stop for depth of field and shutter speed for the conditions of the scene, we can select the ISO for a proper exposure. ISO is a camera's sensitivity to light, starting at 100 for most cameras and increasing to 25,000 and even higher. The higher the ISO, the more noise and grain you'll introduce into the final image.
Now for selecting our ISO. The first image I'm going to shoot at f4 ISO 100 to show you how to freeze the action. The next image I'm going to shoot at f16 with an ISO much higher to freeze the action.
Tips for using this step. Use higher ISO and high shutter speeds to freeze action. Number 2, use low ISO and low shutter speeds to blur action. Number 3, combine ISO and shutter speeds for a unique and creative effect. Step 6, take the image. Step 6 is the most obvious of all the steps in the Ultimate Photography tool, but it's not to be overlooked by snapping a shot and moving on to the next. Yes, the action is simple, but it is a culmination of the steps you have taken to create an amazing image. With digital cameras, take a few seconds to review the image. Did you capture what you intended to? If so, great. If not, return to the step where you want to make changes until you get the shot you are looking for. Each time you follow the steps, you will start taking better images and take your shots to the next level.
Now it's incredibly important to review the image after you take the shot to make sure you captured what you intended.
Tips for using this step. Number 1, consider using a tripod for slower shutter speeds. Number 2, when reviewing the back of the camera, check for focus, depth of field on the main subject. This is a simple explanation of the steps for the Ultimate Photography tool. However, much more information is contained within the 2-page Word document. If you have questions, please comment below. Otherwise, I hope you learned something from this video and wish you the best in your next photography adventure.